We're finally here. Phantasy Star I, the start of something new and a trailblazer of an RPG that pushed the Master System beyond the limitations it was once believed to have. Phantasy Star II, a daring sequel that yearned to take the series in a bold direction for the sake of a gripping narrative only possible on next-generation hardware. Phantasy Star III, an ambitious, if flawed game that a new team tried their best to bring to the same heights as the previous two entries. With varying levels of quality, time constraints, and a market still not fully accepting of RPGs among other things, it's no wonder this series found itself in the odd position it was in after these 3 games. What it needed, what fans of the series needed, was a game to put the main story back on track and have the entry be designed by the ones who grabbed our attention in the first place. A sentiment that thankfully Sega agreed with. In fact, things were looking much better development-wise already, as the team themselves wanted to begin work on a new entry right as the company tasked them with the very mission. They weren't crunched for time, the team wasn't split apart, and no crazy deadlines were thrown onto them. This game was given a proper amount of time to really cook, coming out 3 years after Generations of Doom. Compare this to the annual releases of the preceding games, mayhaps the company learned that rushing games isn't the way. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I couldn't say that with a straight face. Within those 3 years, the game saw a lot of changes, at one point even being planned for the Genesis CD add-on before switching over to the standard hardware. Would have been cool to see how that turned out, but either way, the team was trying to go big with this one. Remember how Phantasy Star 2's 6 megabit cartridge was the biggest game on the market at the time? Yeah. This game was 24 megabits. The rate of progression back then was crazy. Hell, upon release, many were already looking towards the next generation of consoles with true groundbreaking 3D graphics. As a result, this and a few other late Genesis games were unfortunately overlooked, but in retrospect, it seems to me that this is the most popular game in the series by a lot. Just talking about the franchise as a whole with fans, the first games to come up are the online titles, and this one, specifically this one. Not Phantasy Star 1, 2, or 3, but Phantasy Star 4. At a glance, it seems that the team achieved their goal, making the biggest, best Phantasy Star possible, which is a good thing because alongside that, it was also meant to be the last. Yep, you heard that right. This was it. The series story was reaching a natural boiling point, so why not let that bad boy sizzle? Mad respect to the team for acknowledging that this would be the best stopping point rather than letting it go on for too long, and I knew this was the case even when I was simply playing the first game. But my dudes, it's one thing to be told that Phantasy Star IV is the last chapter. It's another entirely going through the series game by game and experiencing that massive, meticulous build-up firsthand, starting to piece together all the crazy lore, becoming invested in the plot threads developing further over each entry, and yearning to have my questions answered. For it all to come to a head in one, well, explosive finale was hype. And supposedly the game's a banger? Oh man, I was trying to keep my expectations in check, but I was so excited that I almost skipped Phantasy Star 3 to hop in already. Confession, I did play like an hour of it before deciding to give 3 a chance, but man, I really wanted to play this game. A few of my friends even played this one, or are at least more aware of it than the rest of the series. Can I add this to the group of 16-bit RPG greats like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy? Will this become a prime example of Sega deserving to be acknowledged as a source of role-playing greatness? Will this be the best Phantasy Star? I'm so excited! The series was taken care of in full up to this point, and there was nothing standing between me and the game. Shaking with anticipation, I booted up my totally legit Genesis and... expectations. Hype. 2 very dangerous things. It's more often than not a bad omen to go into any game with an idea of how you want it to be. That tends to lead to inevitable disappointment. But sometimes, the game just gets it, and Phantasy Star IV gets it! December 1993 and February 1995 were the times both sides of the world were graced with, yes, another shining result of JRPG's golden era. The lessons learned from previous games, taking everything that worked and expanding upon them in ways I was not only hoping for, but didn't think would happen? Yeah. The game's good. So good that we've got to get into the nitty and gritty because there are a lot of factors that make it so good. So grab yourself a glass of water, get comfortable, and hop into the freaking spaceship, loser! It's time to bring this series to a worthy end with my revolutionary review for Phantasy Star IV, End of the Millennium. Ugh, doesn't that intro song just give you chills? I was already hooked just by booting this game up, a great sign for things to come. And once the game started, the graphics are good again. Matter of fact, this isn't just good, but the best of the bunch by far. Harkening back to Phantasy Star II's visuals, I'm bumping them even further. On top of the rich colors and thick outlines, character sprites have just the slightest bit more detail to stand out that much more, along with a few charming animations to boot, with that attention to the finer points being a philosophy carried over to the whole world in its many locations. Towns, the overworld, and even those dungeons have persistently stuck in my mind, if not for their layout, then for their aesthetical prowess. Everything has so much more depth and distinction, with a few areas even playing with the perspective. No two locations look exactly the same, and a sense of progression was always felt when it came to the visuals. The story begins on Motavia, and it's back to looking like a desert just as it was in the first game, but even still, it's so visually captivating and unique from how it was in both of its past incarnations. The same can be said for Dazores, as well as the boatloads of other locations that may seem a little familiar. The fan service in this game is pretty damn good, that of which I'll get more into later, but whenever I was looking at it all, at the very least, my eyes weren't complaining. Battles are also back to the third-person perspective, with animations across the board having more frames and detail. That goes for both you and the enemies, by the way. It truly feels like we're taking advantage of the more powerful hardware this time around. As you may have noticed, we're not on the Tron grid anymore, but instead, taking a page from the game that started it all and giving battles unique backdrops that correlate to where you are at the moment. In fact, both the world's visuals and monster designs made an incredibly exciting fact that much more apparent. That being the science fantasy blend is finally seamless, balanced, and as natural as it always should have been. We're not leaning towards one side more than the other, we aren't saving another half of the coin for later in the game, we aren't particularly one genre while sprinkling elements of the other here or there. No! This is a science fantasy, with the two working together as well as I knew this series was capable of, as well as this series showed us it was capable of in 1989. You know what? Better late than never. And in a weird way, the previous two entries being as unbalanced and biased as they were helped to make this game's thematic cohesion feel all the more satisfying. One way or the other, it is good to be back. I'm telling you guys, this creative back and forth is so important because it gave the original game a brilliant art direction and memorable vibe, all of which going double for this game because this is 16-bit. This is the Sega Genesis. And because this game takes as great advantage of the system as it does, combined with a brilliant art direction, this game is gorgeous, inside and out. On top of what we already said, just look at these characters. And for those who've been sticking with the series, or heck, just my videos, keep a keen eye out. Most of this cast visually derives from an important figure in the past games, some more obvious than others, but all equally as fitting and deserving. Already, this was a great way to get me attached to this group, and let's just say it won't be the last. Shoutouts to the game for letting me look at them as much as I do too, not just referring to the overworld sprites, by the way, or even the battle screen. I mean the cutscenes, because we've got a substantial amount of them. I'll give Phantasy Star III credit for providing an alright amount, but considering I didn't think they were all too visually impressive, Phantasy Star II was the real stinker in this regard. The breadcrumbs of art we got all looked great, and here, not only did we get so much more, but it all looks so much better, with all the convincing you need being the first one you see in the main game. Our two leads walk out of the town, and my jaw hits the floor. This was the moment I knew I was in for something special. The somber sunset, dramatic shadows, familiar landscape, striking characters. It's not even that complex, but I can't get enough of this shot. More on this particular scene in just a sec, because I ain't done gushing about the game's cutscenes on the whole. They're done in a comic style, with each panel having unique, quality art that pushes every scene to the level they need to be, to hit as hard as they need to. As a result, I was constantly pulled into the many moments, and the intended emotions were consistently felt. Not to mention, the characters were allowed to be hella expressive due to this presentational aspect. Looking good, looking good. Now back to this scene, some of you might be wondering what else there is to talk about. Well, in order for you to understand, I gotta shut up for a second. Music to my ears. That's right, gamers. They did it. They finally did it. The soundtrack isn't just really freaking good, but a competent size. I can actually stick with the game's music and its official remixes alone for the entirety of this video. It's a miracle! And what a soundtrack will have to accompany us. It's easily my favorite of the quadrilogy, and some of my favorite music on the system. It's seemingly unbound by the usual limitations as opposed to a majority of the Mega-driven library, paving the way for a decent amount of instrumental variety that all sounds great. Even when the music does lean into the Genesis typical twang, it's done in a a more enjoyable manner than I've heard on any other OST trying to do the same thing. And I know that the actual compositions are the culprit for these songs being as great as they are, because when listening to the game's official remasters and mixes, they're excellent as well. So yeah, we'll be sticking with this game's music today, something that's apparently a lot harder to do than I thought. Anyway, I know you're all waiting for me to talk about the story, right? I mean, come on, it is the last game of the series. It's all been building up to this. No, really, it's all been building up to this. Something the opening text alone makes apparent, not shying away from refreshing or spoiling the player on key moments that previous games hosted. Which brings us to a bit of a predicament. I've been trying to keep these reviews as spoiler-free as possible, but since these are an ongoing narrative and this is literally the final chapter, the story includes a lot of big plot twists from earlier entries that are essential background information to grasp what's happening this go around. I tried to dance around it, but there's really no way to give the necessary amount of information required to understand the story without delving into those plot points that I consider spoilers for earlier titles. I'm not gonna spoil this game, but I am gonna spoil those games. So for the lovely viewers who want to avoid all of this, I'm gonna leave a timestamp here so that you can skip my story critiques and head right on over to the gameplay side. As for you all who have played those games, already know the big plot points required to hop into this game, or just don't care, glad to see you all stick around. Let's dive in. So, after the second game especially, the Alco solar system's kinda in shambles. One of the 3 planets, Palma, the main planet from the first game, has been completely destroyed, and Mother Brain has been taken down. You'd think that at the very least was a good thing, but you have to remember that it wasn't just an evil hive mind taking control of people's lives, but the backbone for pretty much all of society and how everything worked. Meaning that after its defeat, the galaxy underwent a dark age referred to as the Great Collapse, resulting in even less communication from the remaining 2 planets, and Motavia regressed back to its desert roots. But after another 1,000-year time skip, it seems like things on Motavia at the very least are getting back on track. Cities have been built once again, technology's making its way back up to the level it was in Phantasy Star II, and the biomonster situation's getting a little back under control thanks to the Hunters Guild, which is where our leads, Alice and Chaz, come into play. The 2 start the game on the job to handle a biomonster outbreak inside of an academy, but eventually they'll begin to piece together how and why these outbreaks are becoming more and more apparent. A setup that sounds very familiar to Phantasy Star II, but trust me, things go in a wildly different direction. You'll be learning about the inner workings of these planets and the reasoning behind past events, all culminating in a climactic final battle, with the journey to reach that point being good, if not a bit unfocused. No use dancing around that this game's pacing is kinda rough. It starts off great, having a clear goal and obstacle for the characters to overcome, but then, well, they do it. They overcome the obstacle, and Chaz is all like, great, we did it, right? Then something else pops up, they take care of that, but oh, now we gotta do this thing. No, now we have to do that thing. No, actually, it's this that's the problem. So on and so forth. It was very odd, and at some point, I was starting to wonder where we were going with it all. Thankfully, this problem didn't bother me as much as it could have for a few reasons. Let's start with this one. Dark Force. One of the biggest lingering questions I had while playing this series was, what the hell's up with this thing? After having it serve as the true final battle of the original Phantasy Star, I remember being extremely confused because it kinda came out of nowhere. I felt a lot better after reading the first game's manual, seeing how it was behind the king's descent into madness, but after running into it again in Phantasy Star II, I was starting to wonder what they had planned for this darkness incarnate. This time around, Dark Force plays a much more in-your-face, prevalent role as different incarnations of the creature will try their best at taking you down, something I really liked. Having the past few games to build it up certainly helped, but all of its different faces and forms provided ample assistance toward making it intriguing at the very least. Especially after getting the full picture beating this game, I'm happy to say that Dark Force is a pretty great antagonist for the series. It does a fantastic job in this game alone, being a constant threat no matter what was going on in the story. The lore behind it was kinda mind-blowing and put a lot of past events into perspective, coming off as if they had a plan for this thing since the beginning, which I seriously doubt was the case, but that's how cohesive it all came off as a result of the answers this 4th installment finally gave. It's like the whole series was a big game of chess, and I was moving some of the most important pieces. Great stuff. Speaking of those pieces, that's the other constant that kept me invested, and it brings me such great joy to say this. It's the cast. The cast! No party member slot fillers, no fluff, all hits, no skips. They are all genuinely well written. We did it! We freaking did it! Turns out that many of the team actually felt that in the last game they worked on, Phantasy Star II, most of the characters were pretty shallow. True. This time around, there was a serious effort to flesh out every single party member, which was apparent with the loads of dialogue, meaningful character interaction that doesn't always have to do with the plot, proper development and progression, and likable quirks from the start. As a result, we have the best cast in the classic series, and it's not even close. These These characters are in another league, which might not sound like much given how I described my feelings towards the previous casts, but even when judged under the larger JRPG umbrella, they hold up. They aren't just good characters within the context of the series, but just good characters. I really like them, and anyone playing this game will easily find themselves feeling the same way. Alice and Chaz already set the bar pretty high in the game's opening moments with their banter and attention-grabbing personalities, with Chaz eventually becoming my favorite lead in the series. Yeah, Phantasy Star 1's Alice finally got the throne, look at that. And with that said, he's not even my favorite in the game. That would be Rika, with her adorable fish out of water moments and heart-tugging dialogue on multiple occasions. Rune was great as well. I never got tired of seeing him butt heads with Chaz, and some later revelations made him that much cooler. My boy Ren is back from Phantasy Star 3, that was an awesome surprise, and it just goes on and on for the rest of the party. There's a core 4, but other characters come and go fairly often, which I actually really liked. I always respect when a game isn't afraid to mess with your party for the sake of its narrative. And this game loves to shuffle your setup at any given moment, but it always manages to use every character's time effectively, meaning no matter how long they were there, I grew attached due to sound writing and solid characterization. This is what I've been waiting for, and as you can tell, I ended up more than satisfied. And while they were getting all their time to shine, those unanswered questions I had with earlier titles, if Dark Force was any indication, were all acknowledged in satiating ways. It felt like every single loose plot thread from earlier titles had an intended conclusion from the very beginning. I loved learning more about Noah, the reason behind the whole solar system's existence, and I especially loved seeing older areas within a new time frame. Like I said, there's a good amount of fan service, but it's all done in a way that swerves potential pitfalls other series fall into. You don't go to past areas because, whoa, look at that series, fans, it's the thing from the game. No, it's done in service of creating and establishing a world, or in this case, worlds. You're not going to these places for no reason, they're just a part of the universe this series has been building up, meaning every location also has a rich history and a ton of substance. Because of this, the Algol solar system doesn't just feel or look alive, it is alive. It's so easy to get lost in it all because of the seemingly effortless, captivating nature, but this is the results of years of buildup. We really worked for this and are reaping the rewards at an unfathomable rate. I gotta be honest, I didn't really care that the pacing was so weird while playing the game because everything else was so enjoyable. I was just here for the ride and was getting rewarded as a series fan anyway, so I was good. Though that said, I imagine people playing this game without having experienced older titles don't feel much of anything from stuff like Rika being based off of Ney, seeing the Alice and Meow statue, Zio summoning Dark Force as early as he does, or any other things that derive from earlier titles. So perhaps coming into this game from that lens paints this narrative in a bit of a weaker light since there isn't as much to help out the awkward pacing. But seeing as I did experience earlier titles, I had a blast and found the story to be somewhat flawed but great nonetheless. The fan service and characters, along with the multitude of baller moments they all provided, made the story for me, and that ending, such a satisfying conclusion to all 4 games. I was pretty sad to see it go, but let me save all of that for the end of this review. After all, we've got to talk about the game parts of this video game, right? For starters, look at this movement speed, guys. I didn't even have to put in a mod to make it like this, which I did for literally every other game in the series. This is great, and as you can tell, is how I felt every game should have been out of the gate. Nice to know I don't need my usual M2 goodness this time around when I'm exploring, or even when I'm fighting at that. Yeah, gamers, I played this one vanilla. Are you proud of me? Prove it. Like the video, then leave me a comment specifically telling me you're proud, because that is the only way I'll know. Thanks! Anyway, as I was saying, I didn't use any of M2's multipliers. The game was balanced hella nicely, but we're kinda getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start off with the basics. As usual, they're mostly the same. Attack, defend, use techs, items, or run away. But beyond that, this game introduces a few notable mechanics that round out the battle system quite well. For starters, you may notice that turns are executed in a more traditional fashion, unlike Phantasy Star 2 and 3. You will be telling every character what you want them to do every turn. But to find a middle ground between this and the past 2 entries, we now have macros, orders you can set up within the main menu to execute specific actions in a specific order, barring any other enemies that may act in between. This is an excellent, natural progression of auto battling that's just better in every way. Damn right I used the heck out of it over my playthrough. Another great addition is battle skills. Techs still use TP, but skills all individually have their own counters you can replenish at ends, meaning they add another layer of strategy and resource management while having their uses against specific enemies. What's more, they work especially well with macros, because if you use certain party members' skills with each other, you'll discover hidden combination techs that, usually do a good amount of damage, but never fail to look badass and flashy. Unfortunately, these aren't implemented as well as they could have, and I actually didn't even know how to use them until wrapping up some late game side quests. Oh yeah, this game has side quests. More on this later, but that's a series first. Isn't that cool? Anyway, combination techs. In order to do these, you have to pick each character's respective skills that are able to be combined, which is one thing. But the problem is that they have to be used in a specific order and the character's turns have to be back to back. You'd think that this wouldn't be a problem thanks to the macro system, but you have no way of knowing if an enemy will act in between the two characters since there's no displayed or consistent turn order, ruining the combination, and there's nothing you can do about this. And sometimes they just don't work, which, I mean, Great. So when you do pull off these combo techniques, it's a sight to behold and pretty freaking cool, but it's not reliable, which I'll admit is a bit of a shame. Although considering how much of the game I played perfectly fine without even knowing how to do it, it can't be that big a deal, right? After all, even at its simplest, this game remains enjoyable and engaging because it takes the series back to its challenging roots, in a way that feels the most fair at that. I had to grind, 3 times, and even then, it wasn't by much because the game gives you a lot more options to work with in order to emphasize player skill and proper strategy rather than stats. The game's not so hard to where an experience multiplier feels like a requirement, and it's not so easy to where I'm able to just mash the auto attack option through every battle. Even a good amount of normal encounters caught me off guard, which occasionally grinded my gears since I kinda wanted at least a few battles to catch my breath, but like I said in the last review, I love that this series is hard. It's one of my favorite parts about it, and this game is the best of the bunch, not just in this aspect, but at least in regards to combat, it's just the best. Period. The cherry on top, this game actually has a good amount of boss fights, notable boss fights, except for this one. This one sucked. But every other major fight, awesome stuff, challenging me and ending up as the standout moments they strove to be. They've got unique music, a few of them kicked my ass. All is right. God, this game is so good. Which makes me even happier that we have some actual side content to prolong it in a valuable way. You're able to go to the Hunters Guild in order to complete requested jobs that result in you fighting some great optional fights and potentially even entirely new areas. The sense of exploration in this game is off the charts, as I found myself just stumbling upon whole dungeons that are missable, and they actually reward you with valuable items and secrets, most of which I ran into the very end of the game. Did I mention that you can miss these? This harkens back to the Master System original, where the world was your oyster and you could go wherever you wanted, which I loved. But I love this game for constantly having a set path and destination while also allowing you to go off the beaten path and find something of value even more. We're able to have some kind of focus while concurrently allowing the player to express themselves in a way the game acknowledges. And those dungeons, optional or otherwise, they're good. No crazy puzzles or anything, but they're paced better, have tons of chests to reward exploration, and a few have unique set pieces to keep them memorable. It appears that at some point they were planning to be 3D like the first game, but they go for the top-down view once more, which I, of course, prefer. So this is another aspect of the game that trumps every older title's previous attempts, being a direct improvement from all of them. They aren't hair-pulling labyrinths like the ones in 2 or way too simple intermissions like the ones in 3. They strike a balance and have some of the better, more immediately enjoyable layouts than we've seen the entire series attempt to reach. You know that this game has great dungeon design when it falls into the Phantasy Star 1 and 2 trap, having that one dungeon that's way longer and harder than the rest, yet I still loved it. It felt great to overcome, and maybe that's as a result of the fantastic fan service it housed, but it was memorable, and the boss at the very end was one of my favorites in the game. Not to mention it has a midpoint that's there to let you exit, save, and get your progress back through a shortcut, so they knew what they were doing. The positives, man, they just keep on going. There are so many more elements within the world to interact with. Tons of NPCs have interesting things to say that change depending on certain events within the story happening nearby. Entire exchanges that are missable help to develop these characters even further. The hint flavor text seen in the 2500 remakes all started here, meaning even more dialogue, and the game directs the player enough to where they don't have to use a guide. It goes on and on and on. My few major problems were ones I didn't even care about that much because the good far outweighs the bad in every instance. I kid you not when I say that the team behind this game took everything that worked from past entries, brought them back, then improved on what all that didn't work from past titles in order to make the best game they possibly could have, while introducing new ideas to round the experience out. The formula? It's been perfected. The fantasy? It's been mastered. Stars out of 10. This game is so good. What the heck? Why is nobody talking about this? At least to the extent of the other big hitting 16-bit titles, it deserves to be in those conversations when discussing the so-called golden era of RPGs. It's as unique as it is amazing, servicing fans and entertaining newcomers alike. Where I struggle to recommend older titles regardless of my affection towards them, there isn't a hint of hesitation when recommending this one. Play this game. God knows you've got plenty of ways to do it, and if you like it, maybe you'll find something to enjoy from the older titles. Who can say? Whether you do or not, that doesn't change the fact that I love this game. I adore this game. It's one of the very best on the Genesis, one of the best in its gaming generation, and in my mind, the best when it comes to the series. Phantasy Star didn't just burn out of energy when it was done, rather it concluded with a hella big bang. And as someone who saw it through from the very beginning to the very end, I was nothing but satisfied. Whether you played the previous games to reach this point or are only interested in this one, you will not be disappointed, as this is a science fantasy spectacle that deserves to be remembered for generations to come. A hell of an end to the millennium. The end. The end, huh? Man, this is really it, isn't it? This is really the end of the Phantasy Star series. Wow. You know, when I first started this journey, I didn't think it'd be one that extended beyond the first game. All I really wanted was to see what Sega's first RPG was about, and even then I was primarily gonna sink time into the 2500 remake rather than the original. But of course, as life proves time and time again, nothing went according to plan. I ended up playing both versions all the way through, preferring the 8-bit version, then dedicating a chunk of my 2022 to experiencing the 4-part Algo saga. One way or another, I found myself carrying to a level I would have never expected, and can confidently say that I'm a new fan of the series who's looking forward to someday trying the future games like Universe or the online MMOs. Later though, I would like a bit more time to just sit with the great feeling this last game gave me. It really concluded the series in the best way possible and made going through all of them worth it just on this front alone. I said earlier in the review that I was sad to see the story go, along with its world and characters, and I meant that. Palma, Motavia, and Dezores, the classic 4 heroes, Rolf, Nate, and literally everyone in Phantasy Star IV, Algo as a whole will always hold a special place in my heart, but I truly am glad they got their happy ending and don't want to touch that. I instead look forward to more from this team because while Phantasy Star IV marks the end of an era, it's also the beginning of a new age. The team behind this game went on to form Overworks, one of my favorite divisions within the Sega company responsible for more excellent titles I'm sure we'll be talking about on this channel in the near future. And that alone is reason to get excited. This game really mattered and had an influence. It means something, not just to me, but to the company. It didn't matter if the game failed to have as big an impact upon release, we're still talking about it. The legacy is still honored, the story goes on, and with that resulting in a group as talented as Overworks, and the game in general being as phenomenal as it is, that's beautiful. Truly a fitting end to the wonderful, scientifically fantastic story known as Phantasy Star.